Hello, welcome back to Haunted Pages. This episode is titled, When Love Restores a Wounded Life. Some stories haunt us through fear. Others haunt us through sorrow. Silas Marner is a story shaped by loneliness, betrayal, and isolation, but also by the quiet possibility that a wounded life can still be restored. When I finished this novel, I felt unexpectedly sad. So many painful things happened that never had to happen at all. And yet, beneath that sadness, there's also something deeply hopeful in this story. Because George Eliot asks whether love can slowly rebuild what suffering has nearly destroyed. At the beginning of the novel, Silas feels emotionally closed off from the world around him. Betrayal and injustice have made him isolated and mistrustful. His life becomes small and repetitive, centered almost entirely around work and gold. And George Eliot portrays that isolation with such sadness. Silas survives, but he is no longer truly connected to other people. The emotional atmosphere surrounding him feels cold, lonely, and inward. What stood out to me about Ravelot is that it ultimately feels like a community capable of love. The novel does not pretend every person is good or trustworthy. There are selfish people in Ravelot, just as there are everywhere. But there are also people willing to help Silas and slowly welcome him into the life of the community. One of the most meaningful transformations in the novel is watching Silas move from isolation to belonging. Epi changes the emotional atmosphere of the novel completely. Through loving and raising her, warmth slowly returns to Silas's life. What moved me most was not simply that Silas cared for Epi, but that loving her transformed him into a more open-hearted person. His world, which once revolved around fear and survival, gradually becomes centered around relationship, responsibility, and love. Another character who deeply stayed with me was Dolly Winthrop. Dolly becomes a kind of quiet blessing in Silas's life. When Eppie enters his care, Silas knows almost nothing about raising a child. But Dolly helps him patiently and kindly, never making him feel incapable or small. What makes her character so moving is that her goodness is not dramatic. It appears in ordinary acts of care, friendship, and steady presence. Dolly reveals something hopeful about human nature, that people are capable of being genuinely kind and helpful, especially when someone is struggling to rebuild their life. At its heart, I think Silas Marner is asking whether love can restore a wounded life. Silas begins the story emotionally closed off because of betrayal and suffering. But healing slowly becomes possible once he allows himself to love and care for another person again. One of the quiet challenges of the novel is this idea that people should not be afraid to care for others. Dolly does this, Eppie does this, and eventually, Silas learns to do this too. George Eliot seems to suggest that opening our hearts is risky because love can absolutely bring pain and vulnerability. But she also suggests that a life closed off from love becomes smaller and colder. The novel ultimately asks whether we are willing to love anyway. One of the moments that affected me most was Silas's willingness to let Eppie go if it meant she would have a better future. Even though it would deeply hurt him, he still wanted what was best for her. And that kind of love feels deeply human. It is love that does not cling selfishly. It is love willing to sacrifice. What Silas Marner quietly taught me is that there really are good people in the world. People willing to walk through life beside others and help carry their burdens. The novel reminds us that even in a world where money and status often seem important, there are still people who understand what love truly is. Eppie is offered a possibility of a very different life, and yet she chooses to remain with Silas because she knows where she belongs. And only love can create that kind of bond. I think that's why the story still matters today. It reminds us that love is one of the few things capable of truly restoring people. There are still people in this world who want it to be gentler kinder, and better. And Silas Marner quietly insists that love, real love, does not exist to condemn or judge, but to remain faithful and steadfast even through suffering. Each story leaves a trace, sometimes as warning, sometimes as invitation.